My name is William Carter. I was a sergeant in the 1st Cavalry Division, also known as the 1st Team, during the Vietnam War. I got deployed to Vietnam in the summer of 1968 when I was just 21 years old. I came from a small town in Ohio, a place where the biggest excitement was Friday night football games. I never thought I'd end up halfway across the world fighting in a jungle I'd only ever seen in pictures. But life has a way of throwing curveballs, and before I knew it, I was holding an M16 rifle and wearing fatigues that never seemed to stay dry in the oppressive heat. We operated in central Vietnam, mainly around the Ia Drang Valley. The name probably doesn't mean much to people now, but back then, it was infamous among us soldiers. It was a hellish stretch of dense jungle, rolling hills, and open fields that were perfect ambush sites for the Viet Cong. The locals called it the Valley of Death, and for good reason. When I first landed in country, the smell of the place hit me hard. It was this mix of wet earth, decaying vegetation, and something metallic I couldn't quite place. It clung to everything, including you. The humidity made it feel like you were breathing through a wet rag, and the noise of the jungle was constant. Birds, insects, and the occasional distant thud of artillery or bombs. That was the soundtrack to our lives out there. The first few weeks were disorienting. The jungle felt alive, like it was watching us. Every step felt dangerous, because you never knew if you were about to trigger a booby trap or step on a landmine. The Viet Cong were masters of blending into their environment. We'd be patrolling, and everything would seem fine until suddenly it wasn't. They'd spring out of nowhere, open fire, and then vanish as quickly as they came. One of my first missions was a reconnaissance patrol near a small village called Play Me. Our orders were to scout the area and assess enemy movement. Intelligence suggested the Viet Cong were using the nearby trails to move supplies, and we were supposed to confirm that. There were 8 of us, and we moved in a staggered formation, keeping a good 10 to 15 feet between each man to avoid all of us getting wiped out by a single grenade or mine. I remember the jungle being eerily quiet that day. Usually there were birds chirping and insects buzzing, but that day it felt like the whole place was holding its breath. That's a bad sign. You learn to trust the silence, because it often means trouble is nearby. Sure enough, about an hour into the patrol, we found ourselves in an ambush. The first sign was a slight metallic click. It was subtle, but one of the guys in front froze. We all stopped, scanning the area, hearts pounding. That's when the jungle exploded. Claymore mines went off, sending a hail of shrapnel into the trees around us. I hit the ground, barely avoiding a chunk of jagged metal that embedded itself in a tree trunk where my head had been moments before. Chaos erupted. Gunfire from AK-47s crackled all around us, and the air filled with the sharp, acrid smell of cordite. The Viet Cong had the high ground and were shooting down on us from concealed positions. We returned fire, but it was like trying to shoot shadows. They were so well hidden, and every time we thought we had a bead on one of them, they'd disappear and pop up somewhere else. Our radio operator, a young guy named Morales, scrambled to call for air support. He was shaking so badly, I thought he was going to drop the handset. I tried to calm him down, but honestly, I wasn't much better off. My hands were slick with sweat, and my trigger finger felt like it had a mind of its own, firing bursts at anything that moved. Then came the sound of rotor blades in the distance, a pair of Hueys bringing reinforcements and firepower. The sight of those helicopters was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. They swooped in, unleashing rockets and machine gun fire on the enemy positions. The jungle lit up with explosions, and the Viet Cong started to scatter. We used the chaos to regroup and pull back to a safer position. When it was over, we counted the cost. 2 of our guys were dead, and 3 more were wounded. I'll never forget the look in Morales' eyes as he stared at the lifeless body of one of our buddies. It was a mix of shock, sadness, and something else, maybe guilt. We all felt it to some degree. You can't help but wonder if there was something you could have done differently to save them. That night, as we set up camp in a slightly more secure location, the jungle seemed quieter than usual. I sat there cleaning my rifle, the motions almost robotic, while the rest of the guys either tended to the wounded or sat in silence. The smell of blood and gunpowder lingered, mixing with the ever-present jungle stink. I didn't sleep much that night, and I don't think anyone else did either. The jungle had taken two of our own, and we knew it wasn't finished with us yet. After that ambush, things changed for me. The jungle stopped being just a place. It became an enemy. It felt alive, like it was conspiring with the Viet Cong to swallow us whole. Every rustle of leaves, every broken twig sent my heart racing. You start seeing things that aren't there, jumping at shadows. But sometimes, those shadows are real. A few weeks later, we were tasked with another patrol, this time deeper into the valley. Command had intel suggesting the Viet Cong were setting up a supply cache near a river crossing. They wanted us to locate it and, if possible, destroy it. The mission was classified as low risk, but by then, we'd learned that was just another way of saying, you're on your own if things go sideways. There were 12 of us on this patrol, led by Lieutenant Harris. He was a good officer, one of those rare ones who actually listened to his men. He didn't act like he was better than us just because he had bars on his collar. He carried the same M16 we did and trudged through the same mud. We respected him for that. The first few hours were uneventful. The jungle was thick, the kind of thick where sunlight barely reaches the ground, and the air feels heavy in your lungs. We moved cautiously, our boots squelching in the mud. Every few minutes, someone would raise a hand to stop the column, scanning the dense foliage for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the oppressive silence of the jungle. Around midday, we reached the river crossing. It was a narrow, slow-moving stream with water so dark it looked like oil. Harris split us into two groups. One would stay on our side of the river to cover the crossing, while the other would move across to scout the area. I was in the crossing team, along with a guy named Davis, who was one of our best point men. He had a knack for spotting booby traps and hidden paths. As we made our way across the water, I felt exposed. The jungle on the other side seemed to close in around us, the trees leaning forward like they were watching. We moved slowly, checking every step. Davis was up front, crouched low, his eyes scanning the ground for any signs of trouble. We didn't make it far before he froze and raised a fist. We all stopped, our rifles at the ready. Davis pointed to a small patch of ground ahead, where the leaves looked disturbed. He carefully moved closer, brushing away the debris with the barrel of his rifle. That's when we saw it, a tripwire, nearly invisible in the dim light. It was connected to a crude but deadly trap, a grenade rigged to explode if the wire was tripped. Davis disarmed it with practiced precision, his hand steady despite the sweat dripping down his face. He gave us a thumbs up, and we continued. But finding that trap only made us more anxious. It meant the Viet Cong knew this area well, and they'd probably set up more surprises. Sure enough, a few minutes later, we stumbled onto the supply cache. It was hidden in a small clearing, camouflaged under a thick layer of palm leaves and mud. There were crates of ammunition, food supplies, and medical gear, along with several AK-47s and even a few RPG launchers. It was a gold mine of enemy resources. Harris ordered us to rig the cache with C4. We worked quickly but quietly, knowing we didn't have much time before the enemy returned. I was sweating bullets, my hands shaking as I set the charges. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As we finished setting the explosives, Davis signaled us to stop. He had that look on his face again, the one he got when something wasn't right. He gestured toward the jungle edge, where the foliage seemed denser than it should have been. I stared at the spot, trying to see what he saw, but it just looked like more jungle to me. Then I heard it, a faint rustling, followed by the unmistakable click of a rifle safety being disengaged. My blood ran cold. The Viet Cong were here, and they were close. Harris whispered for us to hold our fire and fall back toward the river. We moved as quietly as we could, our boots barely making a sound on the damp ground. But the enemy was closing in. You could feel it, like the jungle itself was tightening around us. We didn't make it far before all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from the trees, the sharp cracks of AK-47s echoing through the jungle. We hit the ground, returning fire blindly into the foliage. I couldn't see a damn thing, just flashes of muzzle fire and the dark shapes of the enemy moving between the trees. One of our guys, Reynolds, went down almost immediately a bullet catching him in the chest. He gasped, clutching at the wound as blood poured out. I wanted to help him, but there was no time. The Viet Cong were closing in, and we were outnumbered. Harris shouted for us to fall back to the river, covering each other as we went. We dragged Reynolds with us, though I wasn't sure he was still alive. The enemy was relentless, their bullets cutting through the air like angry hornets. One of their RPGs slammed into a tree near us, sending splinters flying in every direction. I felt a sharp pain in my leg but didn't stop. Adrenaline is a hell of a thing. It keeps you moving even when your body wants to give up. When we reached the river, the other half of our squad was already firing from the opposite bank, giving us some much-needed cover. We crossed as quickly as we could, dragging Reynolds through the muddy water. Once we were on the other side, Harris ordered us to detonate the charges. The explosion was deafening, a massive fireball erupting in the jungle. The enemy supply cache was gone, and with it, any chance the Viet Cong had of using it to resupply their forces in the area. But we paid a heavy price. Reynolds didn't make it, and another one of our guys, Thompson, was wounded. We set up a perimeter and radioed for a medevac, hoping the Hueys could reach us before the enemy regrouped. As we waited, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of relief and guilt. We completed the mission, but at what cost? The jungle had claimed another one of us, and it wouldn't be the last. The medevac came for us just before sunset. The sound of those rotor blades was like salvation itself. 2 Hueys swooped in low, their door gunners scanning the treetops for movement. We loaded Reynolds' body and Thompson, who was still conscious but pale from blood loss. The rest of us piled in, our rifles at the ready in case the Viet Cong decided to take a parting shot. As we lifted off, I looked down at the jungle below. From above, it seemed peaceful, almost serene, but I knew better. That jungle was alive, waiting for its next victims. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the trees in long shadows. I watched the clearing where we detonated the cache slowly disappear, and for a moment, I felt something like regret. Not for the mission, but for the fact that this was just one battle in a war that seemed endless. We returned to base late that night, exhausted, filthy, and shaken. The medics took Thompson to the field hospital, while the rest of us headed straight to the showers. I stood under the cold water, letting it wash away the grime and blood, but it couldn't touch the weight that had settled in my chest. Reynolds was gone, and the look on his face as he died kept playing in my mind like a broken record. After the shower, I sat on my cot, staring at my rifle. I went through the motions of cleaning it, but my hands felt disconnected, like they weren't mine. Around me, the guys were quiet. Normally, someone would crack a joke, maybe share a story to lighten the mood, but not tonight. The jungle had taken a piece of all of us that day. The next morning, Harris gathered us for a debriefing. He didn't sugarcoat it. Our mission had been a success, but we'd lost Reynolds and Thompson might not make it. He told us to get some rest because we'd be going back out in a few days. That was the thing about Vietnam, there was no time to mourn. The war didn't stop for anyone. Over the next couple of days, I tried to push the ambush out of my mind, but it stuck with me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Reynolds' face, heard the snap of gunfire, and felt the sting of splinters in my leg. I wasn't the only one. Davis, who was usually the most level-headed of us, started jumping at every little sound. Even Harris seemed more tense than usual, though he tried to hide it. When we finally went back out, I felt this deep sense of unease, like something bad was going to happen. Our mission was another patrol, this time in an area known as the Iron Triangle, a dense network of jungle and villages that the Viet Cong used as a base of operations. It was notorious for being one of the most dangerous places in Vietnam. We all knew the stories. Entire squads disappearing without a trace, patrols ambushed and wiped out. It was the kind of place that made you question why you ever signed up for this in the first place. We moved cautiously, every step deliberate, every sound analyzed. Davis was on point again, and I was right behind him. The jungle felt different here, darker and quieter. The trees seemed taller, their branches forming a canopy so thick that hardly any light broke through. It felt like walking through a tunnel with no end in sight. About halfway through the patrol, we found a small clearing. Harris decided we'd take a short break, just long enough to check our gear and catch our breath. I sat down on a fallen log, my rifle across my lap, and took a swig from my canteen. The water was warm and tasted like metal, but it was better than nothing. That's when we found the bodies. One of the guys, Johnson, had wandered a little further into the clearing to relieve himself. He came back pale as a ghost, his eyes wide. He didn't say anything, just pointed toward the edge of the clearing. Harris and I followed him, and that's when we saw them, 3 American soldiers, their bodies tied to a tree, mutilated beyond recognition. Their uniforms were torn, their dog tags missing. It was clear the Viet Cong had done this as a message, though what they were trying to say didn't matter. The sight of those men was enough to make my stomach turn. We radioed the find back to base, but there wasn't much else we could do. The bodies were too far gone to bring back, and we couldn't risk staying in the area any longer. Harris marked the coordinates on his map, and we moved on, our nerves stretched thinner than ever. The rest of the patrol was tense. Every shadow seemed to hide an enemy. Every sound was a potential ambush. By the time we returned to base, we were all on edge. The jungle was messing with our heads, and those bodies were burned into our minds. Even Harris, who was usually calm under pressure, seemed shaken. That night, I sat in the mess tent, staring at my plate of rehydrated potatoes and canned ham. I wasn't hungry, but I knew I had to eat. Across the table, Davis was picking at his food, his eyes darting around the room like he was expecting an attack. None of us talked much. The jungle had a way of stealing your words. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those bodies, their lifeless faces staring back at me. I kept thinking about who they were, where they were from, if their families knew what had happened to them. It made me think of home, of the people waiting for me. I wondered if they'd still recognize me when this was all over. If I'd recognize myself. The jungle wasn't just a place. It was a predator, and we were its prey. And the longer we stayed, the more it felt like it was winning. The jungle silence was the loudest thing about it. You learned to live with the sound of the insects, the birds, and even the occasional distant rumble of artillery. But when the jungle went quiet, that's when you knew something was wrong. After finding those bodies, I couldn't shake the feeling that the jungle wasn't just a backdrop. It was part of the war itself, a force working against us as much as the Viet Cong. Our next mission wasn't much different from the others. Patrol an area near an abandoned rubber plantation where there were reports of enemy activity. It sounded straightforward on paper, but by then we all knew nothing was ever straightforward in Vietnam. The plantation was a strange place. Rows of rubber trees stretched out in perfect lines, their trunks pale and smooth, almost ghostly in the dim light. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and something faintly chemical, probably the residue from the rubber tapping. It felt out of place, too neat and orderly compared to the chaotic mess of the jungle. And it was too quiet. No birds, no insects, just the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. We moved in a staggered formation, spreading out as much as we could while keeping each other in sight. Davis was on point again, and I could see the tension in his shoulders. He hadn't been the same since the last patrol, and honestly, neither had I. About an hour into the patrol, we came across an old shack near the edge of the plantation. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, its roof sagging and walls covered in moss. Harris decided we'd check it out, just in case it was being used as a supply depot or hideout. We approached cautiously, our rifles at the ready. The shack was empty, but it didn't feel that way. There was something off about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Inside, the air was stale, and the floor was covered in rotting leaves. There was an old table in the corner, its surface scarred with deep gouges, and a few empty crates stacked against the wall. It looked like the kind of place someone might have lived in a long time ago, but not anymore. As we were about to leave, Davis noticed something. There was a trapdoor hidden under a pile of leaves and debris in the corner. It was crude, made of old planks nailed together, but it was definitely a door. Harris signaled for us to stay quiet as he and Davis carefully lifted it. Beneath it was a dark hole, a tunnel leading into the earth. The Viet Cong were known for their tunnel systems, entire networks that stretched for miles underground. They used them to store supplies, move troops, and even launch attacks right under our noses. If this shack was connected to one of those networks, it could mean trouble. Harris decided we'd go in, but only a few of us at a time. He didn't want to risk the whole squad getting trapped underground if things went bad. Davis and I were the first ones in. The tunnel was narrow and low, forcing us to crouch as we moved. The air was thick and stale, and the walls were damp, covered in roots that twisted and coiled like veins. I kept my rifle in front of me, the barrel pointing into the darkness. The only light came from the flashlights mounted on our helmets, their beams cutting through the black like knives. The tunnel went on for what felt like forever, twisting and turning in ways that made it impossible to keep track of direction. It was disorienting, the kind of place where you could get lost and never be found. After a while, we started noticing things: discarded ammunition boxes, ration wrappers, and even a pair of worn-out sandals. Someone had been here, and recently. Then we found the room. It was a small chamber carved out of the earth, its walls reinforced with wooden planks. In the center was a makeshift table with a map spread out on it. The map showed the surrounding area, marked with trails, villages, and what looked like enemy positions. This was a command post, a hub for planning and coordinating attacks. Before we could radio back, we heard it, the faint sound of voices. They were speaking in Vietnamese, their tones low and hurried. Davis froze, his flashlight beam trembling slightly. We killed the lights and crouched in the darkness, listening. The voices were getting closer, echoing through the tunnel like whispers carried on the wind. We didn't have time to think. Harris radioed for the rest of the squad to pull back to the shack and set up a perimeter. Davis and I moved deeper into the shadows, trying to stay out of sight. The voices were right on top of us now, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. My finger tightened on the trigger of my M16, ready to fire at the first sign of movement. The Viet Cong emerged from another tunnel entrance, their silhouettes barely visible in the faint light coming from the room behind us. There were 3 of them, all armed, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders. They were talking, laughing, even completely unaware we were there. We waited until they moved into the chamber, then struck. Davis opened fire first, the sharp crack of his rifle echoing through the tunnel. I followed, my shots hitting one of the men before he could react. The third tried to run, but Davis caught him with a burst to the back. It was over in seconds, but the sound of gunfire was deafening in the confined space. We searched the bodies quickly, finding more maps, a radio, and several documents written in Vietnamese. Harris called in the find, and command ordered us to retrieve what we could and destroy the tunnel. We rigged the chamber with C4 and set the charges, then hurried back to the shack. The explosion was massive, the ground shaking beneath our feet as the tunnel collapsed. Smoke and dust billowed out of the trapdoor, filling the shack with the choking smell of earth and explosives. We pulled back to a safer position and waited for the dust to settle. That night, as we camped near the plantation, I couldn't stop thinking about the tunnel. It felt like we'd barely scratched the surface of something much larger, something hidden beneath the jungle. The Viet Cong were always a step ahead, using the land to their advantage in ways we couldn't fully understand. And for every tunnel we destroyed, there were a dozen more waiting to be found. The plantation was behind us, but the jungle never really let go. After destroying the tunnel, we began the long march back to base. It was supposed to be routine, a straight shot through familiar terrain, but in Vietnam, routine didn't exist. We moved cautiously, eyes scanning every shadow, every patch of tall grass. Harris kept the formation tight, his voice low as he gave quiet commands. The weight of the jungle pressed down on us, making every step feel heavier than the last. The air was thick with humidity, and even breathing felt like a chore. About an hour into the march, we came across a trail, a narrow, beaten path that wound through the trees. It wasn't on our maps, but that didn't mean much out here. Trails like this could be made by villagers or the Viet Cong. There was no way to tell the difference. Harris decided we'd follow it for a while, see where it led. The trail took us deeper into the jungle, where the trees grew so close together that their branches tangled overhead, blocking out the sky. The air felt different here, cooler but also heavier, like we were walking into a trap. Davis was up front, his rifle raised, scanning every inch of the path ahead. That's when we heard it, a faint sound, like the snapping of a twig. Everyone froze, dropping to a crouch. Harris motioned for us to spread out, and we moved off the trail into the underbrush. The silence was deafening. The first shot came from the trees to our right, followed by a burst of automatic fire. The Viet Cong had been waiting for us, hidden in the foliage. They had the high ground, and they knew the terrain. We scrambled for cover, returning fire as best we could, but the jungle made it nearly impossible to see where the enemy was. I hunkered down behind a fallen log, my heart pounding in my chest. Bullets snapped through the air, splintering wood and kicking up dirt. I could hear Harris shouting orders, but his voice was almost drowned out by the chaos. We were pinned down, outgunned, and outmaneuvered. Harris called for us to fall back, but moving through the thick jungle under fire was like trying to swim through quicksand. One by one, we broke away, covering each other as we retreated. I don't know how long the fight lasted. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes. When the shooting finally stopped, we regrouped at a small clearing. Harris took a head count. We'd lost 2 men, Johnson and Blake. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. We didn't have time to mourn. Harris ordered us to keep moving, and we did, our steps slower, our spirits heavier. By the time we reached base, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. It should have been beautiful, but all I could think about was the blood we'd left behind. That night, I sat in my bunk, staring at the ceiling. The faces of Johnson and Blake were etched into my mind, joining the growing list of ghosts that haunted me. I realized then that the jungle wasn't just trying to kill us. It was trying to break us, to make us forget who we were. And maybe it was working.